In the last video, we set up this nice workspace to make it easier for us to animate in Blender. So go check that out if you haven't watched it. And in this video, we're going to actually do something with the workspace that we created. So we're going to get into animating using these 4 different modes available in Blender's dope sheet editor. But before we do that, I want to tell you about one final luxury that we can add to Blender to make animating even easier, to decrease the friction and difficulty of getting the ball rolling animating, and that is the Snappy Keys add-on. Snappy Keys is a super simple add-on. There's no settings, there's nothing complicated. You just install it and it just works. Basically makes timeline snapping and keyframe snapping very similar to how it is in programs like After Effects or Premiere or other similar modern software like that. So I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Install, and Desktop. And here I've got the Snappy Keys add-on here. I'll press Install Add-on, and then we'll click this to activate it. And that's it. This is by no means at all required to follow along with this tutorial. We're still going to learn some really good stuff, whether or not you have this add-on or not. But having it will add that extra bit of ease to your life in animating, so I highly recommend it. And hopefully as this tutorial progresses, you'll become even more convinced that it's a nice thing to have. All right, so let's get started on recreating the animation that I displayed at the beginning of this video. So to get started, I'm going to tap X, delete that cube, Shift A, and add a UV sphere. Then I'm going to add a subsurface modifier to it and bump that up to 2. And I'm going to right click, press Shade Smooth, so we have basically a smooth ball here. First things first is we have the ball going back and forth. Actually, I'm going to delete that lamp there because we don't need that, or light, or whatever they're calling it these days. So let's do that. Let's tap I to insert a keyframe here. And I'm going to close that up because I don't need to see all that other stuff. And then I'm going to hold down my middle mouse button and tap Alt so I get into this orthographic view that is closest to where I was, which is the front. And let's drag this down a second. And with Snappy Keys installed, I can just hold Shift before letting the timeline go if it's near a second or half second, and it will just snap to it, which is very useful. Let's press G to grab, Control to constrain, and I just want to move this over a little bit to begin our kind of ping pong back and forth here. Then we'll tap I again, and that inserts another keyframe. Okay, so doing pretty good here. And the little animation, what happens when the ball first reaches the first side is it activates sort of like a force field, and we use grease pencil to create that. So what I'm going to do is hold Shift, snap this here, then I'm going to press Shift A, and under grease pencil, add a blank grease pencil object. I'm going to press G to grab, Control to constrain, and I want to snap this object, which all you can see of it because we made it's blank, is its origin point. I want to snap it right to the edge of where the sphere is at the end of the first second. Hold Shift, let go, let my timeline snap there. So now we want to begin animating in grease pencil. So to do that, we need to switch our dope sheet to grease pencil mode. And what I'm going to do is hold down my middle mouse button and tap Alt, so I can get into the orthographic view here, looking at this side of the sphere. And let's switch this mode to draw mode. So as you can see here, a single keyframe has been entered for when we created the grease pencil object itself, which was a blank object, which means that's blank. And that's good because we want that blank keyframe to start there at 1 second. Now I'm going to tap my right arrow key 3 times just to move my timeline down 3 frames, or you can use these controls here to do that as well. And I'm going to draw my first little ring and start working on the animation of this. But before we do, whenever you are animating grease pencil objects, you always have to enable the auto keying button, so make sure that's activated. Or else whatever you draw, even if you move the timeline, will just stick to that keyframe, the last keyframe that was created. Okay, so got that active. So let's draw the first little ring here. Then I'm going to go down 3 more frames with my right arrow key. And then as soon as I let go of this first stroke, the visibility of that last stroke will disappear like that. 1, 2, 3 again. And I'm not too worried about making this like super perfect or whatever. Like the whole point of this is that we're making like a little stylized animation effect. Like that's kind of the whole point. Okay, so starting at this point, 1, 2, 3 frames again, I'm going to start breaking it up like it's beginning to dissipate. So we'll have like a line here, and then like a line here, and a line here. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see this a little better. And it's dissipating even more and more and more. And 1, 2, 3, and we'll have maybe like one last one where it's very, very dissipated. Of course, we could enable onion skinning if we wanted to, so we could see the previous keyframe a little bit better. That might have been a better thing to do. Okay, so let's drag our timeline back, and so we can watch our little animation now. I'll tap space, and there we go. Okay, so the last thing we need to do here is insert a blank keyframe at the end. That is a keyframe with no grease strokes drawn on it so that it appears that the animation is done. So to do that, all I'm going to do is move this down here, and then I'm going to click select the first keyframe, which I know is blank, and I'm going to press D. So if you have Snappy keys installed, you can just press D to duplicate. And then I'm going to hold Shift and let this go somewhere near that timeline cursor, and it will automatically snap to the timeline cursor. Now, if you're not using the add-on, you can bring the keyframe near that point, press Shift S, and press selection to current frame, which is the same as this timeline cursor because that displays the current frame. However, that will only work if you have one keyframe selected. So, for instance, if I were to select all these and then press G to grab and then like move this near here, and I would press Shift S, selection to current frame, or any of these options, it will collapse all of these into the same point. But if we're using Snappy keys, we can either click drag with the mouse or press G to grab or duplicate. And then whenever we're near the timeline, we can hold Shift and that will snap. The nearest key will snap to the timeline wherever it is. So that's very useful. But in any case, I think we've got done what we need. Also, this will snap to the grid if the timeline is too far away. So that's also very useful with Snappy keys installed. So let's press space. And we got a nice little animation dissipating out here. Okay, let's go back into object mode for time being. And let's watch this from out here. So, all right, so we've got our ball flying, it hits into this invisible barrier and then causes this reaction here. Another thing you might notice in the video is that the glowing ball actually deforms when it hits that point. And what we're actually using there is a shape key. A shape key is basically a way of creating a form of an object, like editing it in some way, and then saving that edited state so that you can morph between those edited states. So you can imagine that shape keys can be used to like make an old face morph into a young face, or a man into a woman, or just anything you can imagine where you edit one state of geometry into another. But in this example, we're going to use it to make the sphere deform, like the weight of it is crushing into it when it hits this invisible force field. So I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that junk I just did. Let's go tab to go back into object mode. And we're going to need to switch this from grease pencil to shape key editor. We could also access the shape key keyframes from the dope sheet. However, of these 4 modes that we're going over here, you cannot access grease pencil keyframes from the dope sheet. not in this current version of Blender anyway. So just keep that in mind, that the dope sheet is for getting a bird's eye view of all 4 of these modes, except for grease pencil. But let's go to the shape key editor here, which we're going to use in a minute to animate our sphere. Okay, so to use shape keys, what you want to do is click on the data tab of the properties panel. This is the object tab. This refers to basically kind of like the outer shell of whatever object you happen to have selected. And this data tab is like the stuff that lives inside of this. For that reason, I really wish that these were right next to each other, but at least they're on the same island. So yeah, that's how you can remember that. And then we have shape keys here. So to make a shape key, you press the plus button, and this adds a basis. So this actually is a shape key, but it's a shape key that represents the original state of the object, the unchanged state. So you actually have to press plus twice when you first get your shape keys going to create the first key. And then whatever key you have selected, when you press tab to go into edit mode, or by some other means go into edit mode, whatever changes you make, we'll switch this to face selection here. Whatever changes you make to the object will be stored in that shape key. So what I'm going to do is go back into object mode, and I'm going to bring the timeline to the point where our little animation is happening, so I can kind of have a reference better of what's going on here. I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to select these 4 faces here. It doesn't really matter which ones, just something close to the center. I'm going to enable proportional editing, and then press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel up so I can get this pretty big, so I don't want it doing like that basically. So we have this kind of like compression happening here. So now when we go back into object mode, the shape returns to how it was. But now if we adjust this value slider with this on the key we just made, we can morph it between that shape and the original basis shape. I'm also going to double click this and rename it to right bounce, just for my own reference. And so this is of course right from my perspective, which is the one that matters because I'm the animator. Now we can animate this. So what we want to happen is not physically what would happen. We're going to fudge it a little bit because this is just a simple demonstration. But a few frames before the actual collision occurs, I'm going to insert the first keyframe. And as you can see, when you're on the shape key editor, as opposed to say the dope sheet or something, you see the shape keys you have and their sliders. And what's cool about this is that you can actually animate these values without this being on, which by the way, this is one of my big pet peeves about the auto keying button, is that I always forget that I left it on. And when you do that, you can end up adding keyframes in weird places. So always remember to deactivate this, unlike me, when you're not using it. So we had it activated when we were making that grease pencil animation earlier, but we definitely need that off for right now. Even with that off, in the shape key editor, whenever you adjust this value of any one of the shape keys that you created, a keyframe will be automatically inserted, which is really cool. So we want it to be static, 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 and then we want it to change here. And then right at 1 is when I want it to reach its full capacity. And then I'm just going to bring my timeline cursor over a little bit, and I'm going to actually select the first one, press D to duplicate it, and then shift and let go so it will snap to the timeline there. And so now we've got this kind of bump happening here. Okay, so we've got it going that side. Now we need to have the ball travel back. So I'm going to drag my timeline, hold shift and let go, let it snap to the second. And we'll switch this back to the dope sheet. And rather than moving this all the way back, then inserting a keyframe, what I can just do is duplicate the original keyframe because it's in the same position I want it to be when it ends up. So I'll press D to duplicate, shift, let it snap, and it moves back. So now we need to have what's happening with the deformation of the right bounce with the left bounce. So what we're going to do is create another shape key. So I'll press plus, and I'm going to rename this to left bounce. We're going to basically do the same thing. I'm going to enter edit mode, and I'm going to select these faces here, G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and do another thing like this. Now I could use specific values for this if I wanted to. I could enter in with the keyboard, but the point is not to make this super perfect. Like, this is a very stylized, organic kind of situation here. Okay, so now we have, let's play this back. So we've got bumping into that, and that fires off. And I think actually I would like the speed of this, the grease pencil little disturbance, to be a bit faster. So let's switch this back to grease pencil. And let's make sure the grease pencil object is selected. And I guess I need to click open here so I can actually see the keyframes of the grease pencil object here. I wouldn't have to do that if I had summary enabled, but I find that in general the summary bar here just messes me up and it confuses me. Just adds more noise. Okay, so yeah, let's make this a little faster. So to do this, I'm going to hold Shift, let my timeline snap here, and then I'm going to press S to scale, and then I think I'm going to scale this by about 25%, thereabouts. And let's press space to see how it goes. Yeah, I like the speed of that a little bit better. All right, going to switch this back to the dope sheet, and let's take a look at this. So we got that. Okay, so we created that second shape key, but we didn't animate it. So let's click on the sphere, switch this back to shape key editor, and there we have that left bounce key that we created. So let's animate it in a similar fashion to how we animated that. So once again, we're going to fudge this a little bit, have it breaking time, breaking space and time by starting to deform before it actually hits the wall there. We want this keyframe to be 0, but to activate that, to go ahead and get it to force it to make a keyframe, we can just drag this up and then drag it back down to 0, and then it will enter the keyframe. And I'm going to tap right 3 times and bring this all the way up. And tap right 3 more times, and I'm going to click on the first keyframe there, D to duplicate, hold Shift, let it snap, and now we've got a bang and a bang. Okay, let's start getting into some material stuff. So I'm going to switch to the rendered viewport mode. Then I'm going to click on, which one do I want here? World properties. And I'm going to change the color, click on here and switch this to black. And I want to go back here to where I can see the grease pencil animation firing off, although I can't really see it that much because it's all black now. So let's change that. Let's select that grease pencil object. Click on material, and I could add a new material, but instead I'm just going to rename this to white, I guess, and change the color because we're going to have it glowing white. And can we see that? Yeah, a little pale looking, but okay. And then I'm going to click on the grease pencil effects and add a glow modifier. I'm going to change this color to be white to look like it's material. And I'm going to reduce this threshold. And so, okay, now we can see the glow coming off, but it looks really bandy. So I'm going to decrease its size to 25 on X and 25 on Y. So it looks a little less dithered. And there may be a better way to do this, but I'm not aware of it. So I'm just going to duplicate this effect twice to make it even brighter. Looks cool. And let's turn off viewport overlays and back up a little bit and watch that glowy explosion happen. Pretty cool. All right, let's turn overlays back on, switch back to solid viewport shading for now. All right, so let's back this up and watch it. We got a bump and we got a bump there. So now we need for this animation of the grease pencil to happen on the other side as well. So what we're going to do is we're just going to select this object, or you can select it from the outliner, and I'm going to press Shift D, and I'm going to tap my middle mouse to constrain and then hold Control. And I want to position this where the ball ends up at the end. I think that's right there. Yep, it is. I'll hold Shift on the timeline, let it snap. Okay, so that's good, but obviously the grease pencil animation there is firing off at the wrong time, so let's adjust that. So with that selected, let's switch the dope sheet mode back to grease pencil. And because we do not have only show selected active in the dope sheet, this shows us all the grease pencil animated things. But let's make this a little easier on ourselves, and we'll click that so we can only see what we have selected. So there's that, and then there's that. And we want this animation to fire off at the second. So I'm just gonna click and drag these, or you could hold G, and then I'm gonna hold Shift and let them snap to my timeline cursor. So now we should have a bang and a bang. All right, so we've about wrapped this animation up, save for a few material effects. Let's go ahead and click back on rendered. Let's click on the sphere, and I'm gonna click on the material, and I could create a new material, but let's just use the default one, why not? And what I'm gonna do is change its emission color. Emission just means glow. That's what that means, emission. I'm gonna change its emission to white. I'm going to drop its strength to 0.5 because we're actually going to animate this value to make it look like it's lighting up like a pinball sort of when it hits into the wall. So we're going to use the same basic strategy that we did before, where we fudge it a little bit. We have it start changing before it actually hits the 1 second line. So about 3 frames before the 1 second line, I'm going to come over here and tap I on this property, and that will insert a keyframe. Of course, to see that, we'll need to be in the dope sheet. So whenever you animate a property, the mode you want to be in to see it is the dope sheet. And then we can see, here's the object where we animated a thing, and it was the material. And if we want to get further into that, we can click it open and click open the node tree that actually got animated. And here's the emission value that actually got animated. So I'm gonna tap 3 over here, and I'm going to raise this all the way up to 3.5. So we got a nice bright glow, and I'm gonna tap I again. Then I'm gonna tap my keyboard 1, 2, 3 frames over on the right arrow key, and I'm just gonna grab this frame, D to duplicate, Shift, let go, let it snap, and so we've got a quick glow up there. So this would look a lot cooler since we're in the Eevee render engine if we turn on bloom effects. So let's go to the render tab and just enable bloom. Now when we play this back, we'll see it glow up really bright, which is really cool. So unlike the shape key editor where we had to make a completely different set of keyframes for our second shape key, here we can just copy over these keyframes because they're performing the same exact actions. So I'm going to bring this over to second 2. I'm going to box select these, press D to duplicate, and I want this to snap to where this is in the center. So I just make it somewhat close to it and then hold Shift and let go, and Snappy keys gives me that confidence that it actually snapped where it was supposed to. And so we're basically done here. Let's click on the turn off the overlays. Let's tap Control-Alt-Space on the keyboard to go into full screen so we can kind of get a nice theater mode and watch our little animation here. We got a bump. Nice. That's the basis of it, but just going back and forth once is not very interesting. So let's make that happen a few more times. So I'm gonna turn overlays back on, go back into solid viewport shading. Okay, so when we set up this workspace in the previous video, we made this kind of small here because we wanted to cut the difference between being able to make it super easy to jump into animating things, but also have lots of normal space for modeling. But you can always feel free to, change the size of this, depending on your project's needs. So we'll expand that just a little bit. So what do we need to repeat? We basically just need all this stuff to repeat over and over. So I'm going to snap this to this second here. I'm going to box select these, D to duplicate. I'm going to hold Shift and let that snap. So it'll be exactly the same as it is over there. And I'm just going to do this one more time. Snap that to the 5 second, box select, D to duplicate, Shift, let that go. And so now we have a pretty sweet back and forth here. Let's see how that looks for the material. In material mode, looks pretty cool. As you can see, the grease pencil keys didn't carry over because, like I said, the dope sheet is a bird's eye view of all animated things except the dope sheet mode of the dope sheet, I mean, is a bird's eye view of all animated things, except the grease pencil. So we'll have to copy those keyframes over like we did with everything else, but that should be the last of what we have to do. So let's do that. Let's switch to grease pencil and turn off the show only selected. And that way we don't even have to have any grease pencil objects selected, and we'll see both of their keyframes. Now remember, if these are closed up here, you'll want to open them up so you can see where these actual keyframes are. Actually, I don't even really need to bother placing my timeline cursor there, because this will also snap to seconds or half seconds, whatever you're closest to, if the timeline cursor isn't around. So I'm going to press D to duplicate, and then hold Shift, let it snap. And grab all these, D to duplicate, hold Shift, let it snap, and we're set up. We got a bong and a bong and a bong and a bong, and we could go on ad infinitum. All right, cool. So we've pretty much finished this little animation. Let's give it another back and forth here. So what good is making an animation if you can't render it out and post it to social media and get attention for it? So let's quickly cover how we would do that. I'm going to go back to solid viewport shading, enable screen overlays. First thing we're going to have to do is set up our camera, because everything renders through the camera. So let's go ahead and make a dedicated little area that we can view through the camera. So I'm going to split this open, bring this open here, and you can either press this button here, or you can tap 0 on the numpad. That's the big block of keys on a big keyboard to the far right, if you have that, or you can just click this. Then what I want to do is resize this camera a little bit by zooming in, and you can just scroll your mouse wheel to zoom in, and then you can also hold Control and hold the middle mouse button down, and then we can zoom in a little bit like that. I just want to have more room to see what I'm looking at, and then we want to press, you can press in to open up this side panel, or you can just drag it open with your cursor. And under view lock, I want to click camera to view. And that way I can now navigate this side of the screen like I would normally by holding middle mouse, shift middle mouse to pan, and then, you know, zooming in and out and whatever. But the camera will follow, as you can see over here. And this makes it much easier to set up how the camera will look when it animates. So let's go ahead and turn on rendered viewport shading and disable overlays. Let's also go ahead and shorten the length of this animation. So this only lasts about 9 seconds. So let's just bring the end of this to where it's at 9, which should be about 270 there. And that way too, when we play this back, it will just repeat that, and this can help us find where we want to position our camera. We could of course get into, you know, animating the actual camera and all that, but I think this video's gone on plenty long enough. I will say that I think I do want to make the camera look, the lens look a bit more dramatic. So I'm going to click on the data tab button, which for the camera is the camera. And I'm going to change its focal length to, let's try something crazy like 15. That may be way too crazy. Yeah, I actually think that's really cool. So maybe 20 instead of 15. All right, that's enough fooling with that. That is not important for the demonstration purposes of this video. Okay, so now we want to render this guy out. To do that, let's go to the little printer tab, the output tab, and under output, we want to select a location. I'm just going to put this on my desktop. I'm going to click this button, click my desktop, click accept, and then I'm going to type a name for it after the last little slash. We'll call it my animation. And so typically if you're rendering animations and stuff out, ping is the absolute best way to do it, especially if you are preserving the alpha channel. What this means is that you can load this into other software and then have way more control over the kind of effects you use in other software, or even if post-rendering in Blender. However, for the purposes of making a little thing and uploading it to YouTube or something, let's switch this to AVI JPEG. And the reason I like AVI JPEG is that, at least on my computer, when I pick FFmpeg for doing like an MP4 or whatever, I always get really bad banding, like in the gradients. And there's a lot of gradients in this, like from when the material glows up. And so I found the best results have actually been with AVI JPEG. So it provides really decently small sized files with exceptional quality. And so that's the mode we'll pick to render this out. And I think we're good to go. So after you've got that set up, just come to render, render animation, and then you should have a nice little animated file on your desktop. All right, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. My challenge to you is that if you followed along with this and successfully completed this tutorial, my challenge is that you find some way to make it your own, like give it a little spin, add some extra objects, maybe make something where it's like bouncing off something else, or come up with another way to animate your grease pencil strokes. If you do this tutorial or a spin-off, which I think would be cool, make it your own a little bit, and you do upload it to your channel, it would be cool if you could hashtag it with Blender Sensei or leave a link back to this video so other people could follow along and make their own version. And finally, if you are missing that kind of timeline and keyframe snapping functionality that you have in programs like Premiere and After Effects and stuff like that, then check out the Snappy Keys add-on. It's available at blendersensei.com as well as Blender Market, or is coming soon to Blender Market anyway. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.